Thus I was left at last with a slim packet of letters and the girl's portrait. She struck me as beautiful. She had a beautiful expression. I know that the sunlight can be made to lie, too. Yet one felt that no manipulation of light and pose could have conveyed the delicate shade of truthfulness upon those features. She seemed ready to listen without mental reservation, without suspicion, without a thought for herself. I concluded I would go and give her back her portrait and those letters myself. Curiosity? Yes, and also some other feeling, perhaps. All that had been Kurtz's had passed out of my hands. His soul, his body, his station, his plans, his ivory, his career. There remained only his memory and his intended, and I wanted to give that up too to the past in a way, to surrender personally all that remained of him with me to that oblivion which is the last word of our common fate. I don't defend myself. I had no clear perception of what it was I really wanted. Perhaps it was an impulse of unconscious loyalty, or the fulfillment of one of those ironic necessities that lurk in the facts of human existence. I don't know. I can't tell. But I went. I thought his memory was like the other memories of the dead that accumulate in every man's life. A vague impress on the brain of shadows that had fallen on it in their swift and final passage. But before the high and ponderous door, between the tall houses of a street as still and decorous as a well-kept alley in a cemetery, I had a vision of him on the stretcher, opening his mouth voraciously, as if to devour all the earth with all its mankind. He lived then before me. He lived as much as he had ever lived, a shadow insatiable of splendid appearances, of frightful realities. A shadow darker than the shadow of the night, and draped nobly in the folds of a gorgeous eloquence. The vision seemed to enter the house with me, the stretcher, the phantom bearers, the wild crowd of obedient worshippers, the gloom of the forests, the glitter of the reach between the murky bends, the beat of the drum, regular and muffled like the beating of a heart, the heart of a conquering darkness. It was a moment of triumph for the wilderness, an invading and vengeful rush which, it seemed to me, I would have to keep back alone for the salvation of another soul. And the memory of what I had heard him say afar there, with the horned shapes stirring at my back, in the glow of fires, within the patient woods, those broken phrases came back to me, were heard again in their ominous and terrifying simplicity. I remembered his abject pleading, his abject threats, the colossal scale of his vile desires, the meanness, the torment, the tempestuous anguish of his soul. And later on I seemed to see his collected languid manner when he said one day, "This lot of ivory now is really mine. The company did not pay for it. I collected it myself at a very great personal risk. I am afraid they will try to claim it as theirs, though. It is a difficult case. What do you think I ought to do? Resist? Eh? I want no more than justice." He wanted no more than justice, no more than justice. I rang the bell before a mahogany door on the first floor, and while I waited he seemed to stare at me out of the glassy panel, stare with that wide and immense stare, embracing, condemning, loathing all the universe. I seemed to hear the whispered cry, "The horror! The horror!" The dusk was falling. I had to wait in a lofty drawing room with 3 long windows from floor to ceiling that were like 3 luminous and bedraped columns. The bent gilt legs and backs of the furniture shone in indistinct curves. The tall marble fireplace had a cold and monumental whiteness. A grand piano stood massively in a corner, with dark gleams on the flat surfaces like a somber and polished sarcophagus. A high door opened, closed. I rose. She came forward all in black, with a pale head, floating towards me in the dusk. She was in mourning. It was more than a year since his death, more than a year since the news came. She seemed as though she would remember and mourn forever. She took both my hands in hers and murmured, "I had heard you were coming." I noticed she was not very young, not girlish. She had a mature capacity for fidelity, for belief, for suffering. The room seemed to have grown darker, as if all the sad light of the cloudy evening had taken refuge on her forehead. This fair hair, this pale visage, this pure brow, seemed surrounded by an ashy halo from which the dark eyes looked out at me. Their glance was guileless, profound, confident, and trustful. She carried her sorrowful head as though she were proud of that sorrow, as though she would say, I alone know how to mourn for him as he deserves." But while we were still shaking hands, such a look of awful desolation came upon her face that I perceived she was one of those creatures that are not the playthings of time. For her, he had died only yesterday. And, by Jove, the impression was so powerful that for me, too, he seemed to have died only yesterday. Nay, this very minute. I saw her and him in the same instant of time, his death and her sorrow. I saw her sorrow in the very moment of his death. Do you understand? I saw them together. I heard them together. She had said, with a deep catch of the breath, "I have survived." While my strained ears seemed to hear distinctly, mingled with her tone of despairing regret, the summing up whisper of his eternal condemnation. I asked myself what I was doing there, with a sensation of panic in my heart as though I had blundered into a place of cruel and absurd mysteries not fit for a human being to behold. She motioned me to a chair. We sat down. I laid the packet gently on the little table, and she put her hand over it. "You knew him well," she murmured, after a moment of mourning silence. "Intimacy grows quickly out there," I said. "I knew him as well as it is possible for one man to know another." "And you admired him," she said. "It was impossible to know him and not to admire him, wasn't it?" "He was a remarkable man," I said unsteadily. Then, before the appealing fixity of her gaze, that seemed to watch for more words on my lips, I went on. "It was impossible not to—" "Love him," she finished eagerly, silencing me into an appalled dumbness. "How true, how true. But when you think that no one knew him so well as I had all his noble confidence. I knew him best." "You knew him best," I repeated. And perhaps she did. But with every word spoken, the room was growing darker, and only her forehead, smooth and white, remained illumined by the inextinguishable light of belief and love. "You were his friend," she went on. "His friend," she repeated a little louder. "You must have been, if he had given you this and sent you to me. I feel I can speak to you, and oh, I must speak. I want you
You who have heard his last words, to know I have been worthy of him. It is not pride. Yes, I am proud to know I understood him better than anyone on earth. He told me so himself. And since his mother died, I have had no one to...
I listened. The darkness deepened. I was not even sure whether he had given me the right bundle. I rather suspect he wanted me to take care of another batch of his papers which, after his death, I saw the manager examining under the lamp. And the girl talked, easing her pain in the certitude of my sympathy. She talked as thirsty men drink. I had heard that her engagement with Kurtz had been disapproved by her people. He wasn't rich enough or something. And indeed, I don't know whether he had not been a pauper all his life. He had given me some reason to infer that it was his impatience of comparative poverty that drove him out there.
Who was not his friend who had heard him speak once? She was saying. He drew men towards him by what was best in them.
She looked at me with intensity.
It is the gift of the great,
she went on, and the sound of her low voice seemed to have the accompaniment of all the other sounds, full of mystery, desolation, and sorrow, I had ever heard. The ripple of the river, the soughing of the trees swayed by the wind, the murmurs of the crowds, the faint ring of incomprehensible words cried from afar, the whisper of a voice speaking from beyond the threshold of an eternal darkness.
But you have heard him. You know,
she cried. Yes, I know, I said with something like despair in my heart, but bowing my head before the faith that was in her, before that great and saving illusion that shone with an unearthly glow in the darkness, in the triumphant darkness from which I could not have defended her, from which I could not even defend myself.
What a loss to me, to us,
she corrected herself with a beautiful generosity, then added in a murmur,
to the world.
By the last gleams of twilight I could see the glitter of her eyes, full of tears that would not fall.
I have been very happy, very fortunate, very proud, she went on. Too fortunate, too happy for a little while, and now I am unhappy for life.
She stood up. Her fair hair seemed to catch all the remaining light in a glimmer of gold. I rose too.
And all of this,
she went on mournfully,
of all his promise and of all his greatness, of his generous mind, of his noble heart, nothing remains, nothing but a memory. You and I.
We shall always remember him, I said hastily.
No,
she cried.
It is impossible that all this should be lost, that such a life should be sacrificed to leave nothing but sorrow. You know what vast plans he had. I knew of them too. I could not perhaps understand, but others knew of them. Something must remain. His words, at least, have not died.
His words will remain, I said.
And his example,
she whispered to herself.
Men looked up to him. His goodness shone in every act. His example.
True, I said. His example, too. Yes, his example. I forgot that.
But I do not. I cannot. I cannot believe. Not yet. I cannot believe that I shall never see him again. That nobody will see him again. Never, never, never.
She put out her arms as if after a retreating figure, stretching them back and with clasped pale hands across the fading and narrow sheen of the window. Never see him. I saw him clearly enough then. I shall see this eloquent phantom as long as I live, and I shall see her too, a tragic and familiar shade, resembling in this gesture another one, tragic also, and bedecked with powerless charms, stretching bare brown arms over the glitter of the infernal stream, the stream of darkness. She said suddenly, very low,
He died as he lived.
His end, said I, with a dull anger stirring in me, was in every way worthy of his life.
And I was not with him,
she murmured. My anger subsided before a feeling of infinite pity. Everything that could be done, I mumbled.
Ah, but I believed in him more than anyone on earth, more than his own mother, more than himself. He needed me. I would have treasured every sigh, every word, every sign, every glance.
I felt like a chill grip on my chest. Don't, I said in a muffled voice.
Forgive me. I have mourned so long in silence. In silence. You were with him to the last? I think of his loneliness. Nobody near to understand him as I would have understood. Perhaps no one to hear.
To the very end, I said shakily. I heard his very last words. I stopped in a fright.
Repeat them,
she murmured in a heartbroken tone.
I want something to live with.
I was on the point of crying at her.
Don't you hear them?
The dusk was repeating them in a persistent whisper all around us, in a whisper that seemed to swell menacingly like the first whisper of a rising wind. The horror. The horror.
His last word, to live with,
she insisted.
Don't you understand? I loved him. I loved him. I loved him.
I pulled myself together and spoke slowly. The last word he pronounced was, your name. I heard a light sigh, and then my heart stood still, stopped dead short by an exulting and terrible cry, by the cry of an inconceivable triumph and of unspeakable pain.
I knew it. I was sure.
She knew. She was sure. I heard her weeping. She had hidden her face in her hands. It seemed to me that the house would collapse before I could escape, that the heavens would fall upon my head. But nothing happened. The heavens do not fall for such a trifle. Would they have fallen, I wonder, if I had rendered Kurtz that justice which was his due? Hadn't he said he wanted only justice? But I couldn't. I could not tell her. It would have been too dark altogether. Marlow ceased and sat apart, indistinct and silent, in the pose of a meditating Buddha. Nobody moved for a time. "We have lost the first of the ebb," said the director suddenly. I raised my head. The offing was barred by a black bank of clouds, and the tranquil waterway leading to the uttermost ends of the earth flowed somber under an overcast sky, seemed to lead into the heart of an immense darkness. This was Scott Dewey reading Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. I hope you enjoyed it.